In the dark streets of New York, where rain made the pavement shiny under the soft glow of street lamps, Dutch Schultz walked like a man who was both feared and marked for trouble. He was a gangster who made his money through secret deals, violence, and never-ending greed. Still, he moved with a quiet intensity, like someone always checking over his shoulder. His name was heard in bars and courtrooms, heavy with danger and heavy with legend. Tonight, his story is not told with loud shouts or gunfire, but in the soft rhythm of memory, where even the toughest lives become gentler with time. Before we travel into the shadows of 1920s New York, I am curious to know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Please drop your city and the current time for you in the comments down below. And if you are ready for the most gripping gangster story ever told, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Trust me, you will not want to miss a single part of what is coming up. The Bronx in 1902 was a borough that was changing. Irish and German immigrants who had found some success were slowly moving north from Manhattan. They were searching for better lives in the growing neighborhoods of Morrisania and Melrose. It was into this world of struggling immigrants that Arthur Simon Flegenheimer was born on August 6, 1902. In a cramped apartment on East 149th Street, his father, Hermann Flegenheimer, was a baker who had come from Germany with dreams of doing well in America. His mother, Emma Noy Flegenheimer, was a very religious woman who worked as a cleaning lady to help pay for the family's basic needs. For the first 8 years of Arthur's life, they had a shaky but steady life. Herman's bakery brought in just enough money to put food on the table, and Emma's strong love for her son promised a brighter future. But in 1910, everything fell apart. Hermann Flegenheimer, maybe crushed by the stress of taking care of his family in a city that kept getting more expensive, or maybe driven by inner demons his son would never understand, simply vanished one morning. 8-year-old Arthur woke up to find his mother crying at the kitchen table, holding a note in her hands that explained nothing and promised even less. Papa had to go away, Emma told her son, her English still heavily accented after years in America. He won't be coming back. Being left behind hurt Arthur in ways that would not show up for years. Right after it happened, the family's situation became desperate. Emma took on more cleaning jobs, working 16-hour days just to keep their apartment. Arthur, now the man of the house at just 8 years old, began spending his days on the streets while his mother worked. The Bronx of 1910 was not kind to kids who had been left behind. Arthur quickly figured out that to survive, he needed to be clever, aggressive, and have no mercy at all. He started his first gang when he was 9. It was a group of boys who were also abandoned or ignored, and they roamed the neighborhood looking for chances to make money. They began with small thefts, taking apples from fruit stands, picking pockets at the train stations, and breaking into empty apartments to steal whatever they could carry. Arthur stood out even among these tough kids. Where other boys might feel sorry after stealing from a store owner who was also struggling, Arthur only felt good about a job well done. Where others might hesitate before a risky theft, Arthur figured the odds with sharp mathematical thinking. By age 12, he was the clear leader of the biggest youth gang in the South Bronx. His first serious arrest happened in 1914 when he was 12 years old. Arthur and 3 other boys had broken into a Bronx apartment and taken jewelry worth almost $500. A huge amount for that time, but instead of selling the goods right away, Arthur had the smart idea to hide them and wait for the police attention to die down. This kind of forward thinking was what would later make him one of New York's most successful criminals. The arrest was a major turning point. Standing in front of the juvenile court judge, Arthur showed no regret, no fear, and no respect for authority. When asked why he had committed the crime, he simply stated, "Because I needed the money." When asked if he understood what would happen because of his actions, he replied, "I understand that I got caught." The judge sentenced him to 18 months in the New York House of Refuge on Randall's Island. For most boys, this would have been a wake-up call. For Arthur, it was like going to graduate school. The House of Refuge was meant to fix troubled youth through discipline, learning, and moral teaching. What it actually gave them was a place where the city's most promising young criminals learned from each other. Arthur soaked up lessons on how to pick locks from older boys. He studied the art of scaring people from repeat offenders, and he built a network of contacts that would help him for the rest of his life. Even more importantly, it was at the House of Refuge that Arthur Simon Flegenheimer began to change into Dutch Schultz. The nickname came from an older boy who said Arthur reminded him of a famous street fighter known as Dutch Schultz, who had caused trouble in the Bowery years earlier. Arthur liked the name. It sounded American, tough, and easy to remember. By the time he was let go in 1916, he had almost completely stopped using his birth name. When Dutch returned to the Bronx at age 14, he found a neighborhood changed by World War I. Factory jobs were easy to find, money was coming in, and chances for crime had grown. His mother, Emma, had hoped that his time away would straighten him out. Instead, she found a son who was colder, more calculating, and more determined than ever to make his fortune outside the law. Dutch's first move was to bring his old gang back together. Most of the boys had either gone straight, gotten arrested again, or moved away. But Dutch quickly signed up new members, picking them with the careful eye of a general choosing his officers. He wanted boys who were smart enough to follow complicated plans, tough enough to handle violence, and hungry enough to see past small-time street crime. By 1917, at age 15, Dutch was running the most advanced youth criminal operation in the Bronx. His gang focused on burglary, but they approached it with amazing organization. Dutch would watch targets for weeks, studying the daily habits of the people living there, finding the most valuable items, and planning escape routes with the precision of a military operation. He kept detailed notes of successful jobs and maintained a network of fences all over the city. It was during this time that Dutch developed his famous temper. Several gang members would later tell stories of times when Dutch would fly into what seemed like uncontrollable rages at the smallest sign of disloyalty or mistakes. But those who knew him best understood that these outbursts were carefully planned, shows meant to keep control and create fear. The act worked. By 1918, Dutch's name was known all over the South Bronx. Older criminals started to notice the teenager who ran his operation like a business and showed no mercy to those who crossed him. When the United States entered World War I and police attention turned to stopping sabotage and keeping the country safe, Dutch saw a chance. He began moving into adult crimes, robbery, shaking people down for money, and assault. His age worked in his favor. Judges and prosecutors were hesitant to punish a young person too harshly, and victims often underestimated the danger from someone so young. Dutch used these advantages without mercy, building a name that would help him when Prohibition created huge new chances for organized crime. But it was his relationship with his mother that gave the most insight into Dutch's character during this time. Even with his criminal activities, he stayed devoted to Emma, giving her money regularly and making sure she never went without anything. He explained his crimes as necessary to take care of her, and she, whether through true belief or simply not wanting to see the truth, convinced herself that her son would eventually leave crime and become a respected businessman. This split personality, a brutal criminal and a devoted son, would mark Dutch Schultz throughout his career. He could order a man's death without a second thought, then spend hours playing cards with kids from the neighborhood. He could terrorize shop owners into paying protection money, then quietly pay for a struggling family's groceries. Those who tried to understand Dutch Schultz always focused on one side of his personality while ignoring the other. It was a mistake. It would prove deadly for many of his enemies. By 1919, as America got ready to enter the Prohibition era, Dutch Schultz was ready. At 17, he had put together a loyal crew, built a reputation for being smart and ruthless, and developed the organizational skills that would soon make him one of the most powerful men in New York. The abandoned boy from the Bronx had turned himself into something much more dangerous, a criminal genius with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The stage was set for the next part of his life, one that would see him rise from street crime to the top of organized crime, building an empire that would stretch across the whole city in creating wealth beyond his childhood dreams. But first, he needed to serve his learning time in the underworld of post-war New York, picking up the skills that would make him not just another gangster, but the beer baron of the Bronx. The end of World War I brought huge changes to New York City, and nowhere were these changes more visible than in the criminal world. Returning soldiers, many of them trained in violence and used to following orders, found themselves struggling in a peacetime economy that offered few chances to get ahead. At the same time, the nation was getting ready for what would become known as the noble experiment, Prohibition. Dutch Schultz, now 17 and hardened by years of street crime, saw the change happening around him. The old-style street gangs that had ruled New York's underworld for years were being replaced by more advanced operations. These new criminal groups required different skills, the ability to manage complicated logistics, maintain relationships with crooked officials, and coordinate large-scale illegal activities. Dutch knew he needed to change or risk being left behind. His first step was to team up with Joey Noe, a small-time bootlegger who was already getting ready for Prohibition to start. Noah was everything Dutch was not: older, established, and connected to the city's network of speakeasy owners and illegal alcohol sellers, but he lacked Dutch's intelligence, organizational skills, and ability to use violence. It was a partnership that helped both men. Though Dutch clearly saw it as a temporary setup, while working for Noah, Dutch learned the basics of the alcohol business. He studied supply chains, understanding how liquor moved from Canadian suppliers through a network of smugglers, cellars, and stores. He memorized the locations of every speakeasy in the Bronx and Manhattan, noting which ones made the most money, which had the best police protection, and which were easy to take over. More importantly, he learned about corruption. Noah introduced him to police sergeants who could be bought, judges who could be influenced, and politicians who needed money for their campaigns. Dutch soaked up these lessons with his usual intensity, keeping detailed mental notes of every crooked official and how much they cost. But it was Dutch's mathematical mind that truly made him different during this time. While other criminals relied on gut feelings and experience, Dutch approached every part of the business with sharp analysis. He figured out the best pricing plans for different neighborhoods, determined the most efficient delivery routes, and created inventory systems that cut down on waste and theft. This analytical approach extended to violence as well. Dutch understood that while brutality was sometimes necessary in the criminal world, random violence was bad for business. He developed what would become known as the Schultz method, a step-by-step approach to intimidation that got the best results while keeping police attention low. The Schultz method involved careful research into a target's weak spots, followed by increasing pressure designed to get them to cooperate with as little actual violence as possible. Dutch would start with quiet threats, move on to damaging property, then personal intimidation, and finally physical harm if needed, but each step was planned to have the biggest psychological impact. And Dutch's reputation soon made the simple threat of violence enough in most cases. His first big success came in 1921 when he found a weakness in Noah's operation. Several speakeasy owners in the South Bronx were buying their liquor from other sellers who offered lower prices but were not reliable. Instead of just matching the competitors' prices, Dutch suggested a different plan. They would offer better service at higher prices, then make it impossible for customers to buy from anyone else. Dutch organized a campaign of steady harassment against the competing sellers. Their delivery trucks were vandalized, their warehouses were broken into, and their drivers were beaten. At the same time, Dutch improved Noah's service, offering guaranteed delivery times, higher quality products, and protection from police raids within 6 months. They had wiped out the competition and raised prices by 30%. The success caught the attention of Arnold Rothstein, the criminal financier who was becoming known as the Brain for his clever approach to organized crime. Rothstein summoned Dutch to a meeting at his headquarters in the Park Central Hotel, a meeting that would shape the young gangster's understanding of how crime could be organized on a truly massive scale. "You've got potential, kid," Rothstein told him during their first meeting. "But you're thinking too small. Prohibition isn't just about selling booze. It's about creating a whole new industry. The guy who understands that first is going to make more money than he ever dreamed of." Rothstein offered Dutch a deal. He would provide money and high-level protection in exchange for a percentage of profits from a larger operation. Dutch would be in charge of building and running the operation, with Rothstein as a silent partner and strategic advisor. For most criminals of Dutch's age and experience, this would have been an opportunity beyond their wildest dreams. Working with Rothstein would give him instant credibility, huge resources, and protection from both the law and rival criminals. But Dutch had learned to be suspicious of partnerships that seemed too good to be true. Instead of accepting right away, Dutch spent weeks checking out Rothstein's other partners. He found out that while Rothstein's partnerships were always profitable, they usually ended with Rothstein in control and his former partners either dead, in prison, or working as low-level employees in organizations they had helped build. Dutch decided to say no to Rothstein's offer, but he did it in a way that kept the relationship going while keeping his independence. He told Rothstein he was honored by the offer, but felt he needed more experience before taking on such a big responsibility. He suggested instead that they work together on specific deals while he continued to build his own organization. Rothstein, impressed by Dutch's caution and strategic thinking, agreed to the modified arrangement. Over the next 2 years, they worked together on several major operations, with Dutch gaining priceless experience in large-scale criminal enterprise while keeping his freedom. During this time, Dutch also started recruiting the men who would form the core of his future organization. He looked for specific qualities: intelligence, loyalty, and the ability to handle violence without losing self-control. His most important early recruit was Lulu Rosenkrantz, a former prizefighter who combined physical toughness with surprising business sense. Rosenkrantz had been working as an enforcer for various criminal groups, but he was attracted by Dutch's organized approach to crime. Unlike other bosses who relied on fear and intimidation to keep control, Dutch treated his men as valued employees offering them training, chances to move up, and a share of profits that showed what they contributed. Another key recruit was Abe Langau, a skilled gunman who had grown up on the same streets as Dutch, but had avoided arrest through careful planning. Landau became Dutch's personal bodyguard and most trusted lieutenant, a role he would keep throughout Dutch's career. By 1923, Dutch's organization had grown to include more than 50 full-time employees and controlled alcohol distribution throughout much of the Bronx. They operated from a network of warehouses, speakeasies, and safe houses with complex communication systems and security measures that made them nearly impossible for law enforcement to crack. But Dutch's greatest new idea during this time was his approach to expanding into new areas. Rather than just moving into new neighborhoods and demanding money from the operations already there, Dutch would study local conditions and find ways to make things run better and more profitably. He would then approach local operators with partnership proposals that offered them better deals than they could get on their own. This approach allowed Dutch to grow quickly without starting the violent conflicts that were destroying other criminal groups. By offering real value to his partners, he built a network of allies rather than a collection of bitter underlings. The strategy reached its high point in 1924 when Dutch arranged the merger of 6 different Bronx operations into a single organization under his control. The merger was presented as a mutual benefit group that would let everyone increase their profits through better coordination and shared resources. In reality, it was a masterpiece of business manipulation that left Dutch in control of the entire Bronx alcohol trade. The success of the merger made Dutch one of the most important crime figures in New York despite his youth. At 22, he controlled an organization that made more than $100,000 per month in profits, equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. More importantly, he had shown the kind of strategic thinking and organizational ability that would be necessary to compete with the major crime families that were forming across the country. But Dutch's greatest achievement during this learning period was his relationship with Joey Noah. Rather than betraying his mentor as soon as he became powerful enough to run things alone, Dutch stayed loyal to Noah and continued to treat him as a senior partner. This loyalty earned him respect throughout the criminal world and built a reputation for trustworthiness that would prove extremely valuable in future negotiations. The partnership ended sadly in 1925 when Noah was killed during a botched robbery attempt by members of a rival gang. Dutch's response to Noah's death showed just how much he had changed from a street criminal to an organized crime leader. Instead of launching an immediate and violent revenge attack, he conducted a careful investigation to find the killers and their reasons. When he learned that Noah's murder had been ordered by a rival bootlegger who wanted to take over their territory, Dutch planned his revenge with his usual precision. Over a period of 3 months, he methodically killed everyone involved in the killing, starting with the gunman and working his way up to the man who had given the order. Each death was designed to send a clear message. Dutch Schultz would not tolerate any threat to his organization or disrespect for his authority. The campaign of revenge made Dutch's reputation for ruthlessness while also showing his strategic abilities. By the end of 1925, at age 23, he stood as the undisputed leader of organized crime in the Bronx and was known as a rising power throughout New York City. His learning period was complete. The abandoned boy from East 149th Street had turned himself into Dutch Schultz, beer baron of the Bronx, but this was only the beginning. Prohibition had created opportunities that went beyond even Dutch's ambitious imagination, and he was ready to grab them all. The stage was set for his rise to true power. When he would build an empire that spanned the entire city, and generate wealth beyond anything the criminal world had ever seen. But success would bring new challenges, new enemies, and finally the attention of law enforcement officials who would prove more dangerous than any rival gangster. The death of Joey Noah in 1925 marked the end of Dutch Schultz's learning period and the beginning of his change into one of America's most powerful crime bosses. At 23, Dutch controlled the most efficient alcohol distribution network in the Bronx, commanded the loyalty of more than 100 men, and had made a name for himself as a strategic genius capable of outsmarting older and more experienced criminals. But Dutch understood that controlling the Bronx was only the first step in building a truly powerful organization. Manhattan, with its hundreds of speakeasies, restaurants, and nightclubs, represented opportunities that were far bigger than anything available in the other boroughs. The question was how to expand into Manhattan without starting a war with the established crime families who considered it their territory. Dutch's solution was, as always, creative. Rather than trying to conquer Manhattan through force, he would make himself essential to the operators already there by providing services they couldn't get elsewhere. His strategy focused on three main advantages: better products, unmatched reliability, and protection from law enforcement. The better products came from Dutch's relationships with Canadian suppliers, who provided real imported liquor instead of the watered-down local alcohol that filled most speakeasy glasses. Dutch had spent months building these relationships, traveling himself to Montreal and Toronto to negotiate exclusive supply deals. The quality difference was immediately obvious to customers who were willing to pay top dollar for authentic Scotch, gin, and champagne. The reliability came from Dutch's organized approach to delivery. While other suppliers operated haphazardly, Dutch kept detailed delivery schedules, backup inventory systems, and backup plans for every possible problem. Speakeasy owners who worked with Dutch knew they would never run out of liquor, even during police crackdowns or supply shortages. But it was the protection that truly set Dutch apart. Through careful cultivation of relationships with corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians, Dutch could guarantee his customers' safety from raids and arrests. This protection was so effective that speakeasy owners began advertising their connection to Dutch as a selling point to customers. Dutch's first big Manhattan success came in early 1926 when he approached the owner of the Club Napoleon, one of Midtown's most exclusive speakeasies. The club's owner, Marcel Dubois, was struggling with unreliable suppliers and increasing police pressure. Dutch offered him a complete package: premium liquor, guaranteed delivery, and total protection from law enforcement trouble. The deal was an immediate success within a month. Club Napoleon became known throughout the city for serving the best cocktails in Manhattan. Wealthy customers who had previously split their time between several places began coming to Club Napoleon exclusively, and the club's profits tripled. Word of Dutch's success spread quickly through Manhattan's speakeasy community. Club owners who had initially been suspicious of the young Bronx newcomer began asking for meetings to discuss similar arrangements. Within 6 months, Dutch controlled liquor distribution to more than 30 Manhattan establishments, generating profits that exceeded his entire Bronx operation. But expanding into Manhattan also brought Dutch to the attention of the city's established crime families, especially Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, who considered themselves the rightful rulers of Manhattan's underworld. Both men first tried to negotiate territorial agreements with Dutch, offering him junior partner roles in their organizations in exchange for leaving Manhattan. Dutch's response showed his growing confidence and strategic skill. Rather than accepting lower positions or jumping into immediate conflict, he suggested a different arrangement. He would continue operating in Manhattan, but would pay the established families a percentage of his profits in exchange for their silent approval of his activities. This proposal was unheard of in the criminal world. Most territorial disputes were settled through violence, with the winner taking complete control and the loser either dying or running away. Dutch's offer of regular payments suggested a more mature approach to organized crime, one that recognized the benefits of cooperation over conflict. Luciano and Costello, both practical men who understood the value of avoiding unnecessary wars, agreed to Dutch's proposal on a trial basis. The arrangement proved profitable for everyone involved and made Dutch a legitimate player in Manhattan's organized crime hierarchy. With his Manhattan operation secure, Dutch turned his attention to improving efficiency and profitability across his whole empire. He set up a main headquarters in a Bronx warehouse where he installed complex communication equipment that allowed him to coordinate activities across dozens of locations at the same time. The headquarters became the nerve center of Dutch's operation, staffed 24 hours a day by trusted lieutenants who monitored inventory levels, tracked delivery schedules, and kept in touch with suppliers, customers, and corrupt officials. Dutch himself spent 12 to 14 hours a day at headquarters, personally overseeing every aspect of the business. It was during this time that Dutch's mathematical genius became most obvious. He developed complex formulas for finding the best pricing strategies, inventory management, and resource distribution. His calculations took into account dozens of factors: changes in demand by season, patterns of police activity, competitor pricing, and supplier reliability. The result was an operation that made much higher profit margins than any of his competitors. Dutch also came up with new ideas for money laundering, developing complex plans to turn illegal profits into seemingly legitimate assets. He set up a network of front companies, restaurants, trucking firms, and retail stores that provided cover for his activities while also making extra money. These businesses were run with the same efficiency as his illegal operations, and many became genuinely profitable enterprises on their own. By 1927, Dutch's organization had grown to include more than 300 employees and made annual profits exceeding $2 million. He controlled alcohol distribution throughout the Bronx and large parts of Manhattan, operated legitimate businesses worth more than $500,000, and maintained relationships with corrupt officials at every level of city government. But success brought new challenges. Dutch's rapid expansion had attracted the attention of federal agents, who were becoming more skilled in their approach to fighting organized crime. The Bureau of Prohibition, led by aggressive prosecutors who viewed the fight against bootleggers as a crusade, began focusing on Dutch as a top priority target. Dutch's response to this threat showed his growing understanding of the criminal justice system. Rather than just bribing individual agents or prosecutors, he developed a complete strategy for protecting his entire organization through legal and political manipulation. The strategy began with hiring the best criminal defense lawyers in New York, men who specialized in finding technical flaws in federal cases and maintaining relationships with sympathetic judges. Dutch paid these lawyers huge fees to ensure they were available whenever any of his associates faced arrest. At the same time, Dutch began building relationships with legitimate businessmen and politicians who could provide political protection for his activities. He made large donations to political campaigns, sponsored charity events, and even quietly funded community improvement projects in the Bronx neighborhoods where he had grown up. These activities created a network of influential people who had financial reasons to protect Dutch's interests. Even if they publicly condemned organized crime, When federal agents tried to build cases against Dutch, they often found themselves facing political pressure from unexpected sources. Dutch's most creative defensive strategy involved systematically infiltrating law enforcement agencies, rather than just bribing corrupt officials. He began recruiting agents and prosecutors who could give early warnings of investigations and surveillance operations. The infiltration campaign was managed with the same precision as Dutch's legitimate business operations. Potential recruits were carefully researched, their financial situations analyzed, and their psychological profiles developed. Only those who showed genuine willingness to be corrupted and had access to valuable information were approached with recruitment offers. By 1928, Dutch had sources within the New York Police Department, the Bureau of Prohibition, and even the U.S. Attorney's Office. These sources gave early warning of planned raids, copies of investigative files, and information about prosecution strategies. The information allowed Dutch to stay consistently ahead of law enforcement efforts, moving inventory and people whenever threats appeared. The effectiveness of Dutch's intelligence operations became clear during the spring of 1928, when federal agents launched what they thought was a surprise raid on Dutch's main warehouse. Instead of finding evidence of illegal activities, they discovered what looked like a legitimate trucking company with proper licenses, clean books, and no trace of alcohol-related business. Dutch had received early warning of the raid 12 hours earlier and had personally supervised the removal of all incriminating evidence. When agents arrived, they found Dutch himself in the warehouse office, reviewing shipping papers and playing the role of a legitimate businessman upset about the disruption to his operations. The failed raid became a turning point in Dutch's relationship with law enforcement. Federal prosecutors realized they were facing an opponent unlike any they had met before, someone who combined street criminal ruthlessness with sophisticated intelligence operations and legitimate business knowledge. But Dutch's greatest achievement during this time was his development of what would become known as the Schultz system, a complete approach to organized crime that combined illegal activities with legitimate businesses, political corruption, and law enforcement manipulation. The Schultz system was based on the idea that successful criminal organizations must be structured like legitimate corporations, with clear levels of authority, defined responsibilities, and standard procedures for every activity. Dutch developed detailed organization charts for his empire with specialists responsible for different parts of the operation: supply chain management, customer relations, financial planning, and security. Each division operated with considerable independence, but reported regularly to Dutch's headquarters, where performance was monitored and strategic decisions were made. The system allowed Dutch to keep personal control over a huge organization while letting trusted subordinates handle day-to-day operations. By the end of 1928, the Schultz system had produced an organization that made annual profits exceeding $3 million, employed more than 500 people, and controlled illegal alcohol distribution throughout much of New York City. Dutch himself had become one of the wealthiest men in America, with personal assets estimated at more than $1 million. But Dutch understood that his success had made him a target for both law enforcement and rival criminals. The prosperity of the late 1920s was creating opportunities for ambitious criminals across the country, and many of them viewed Dutch's territory as ripe for the taking. The challenge would come sooner than he expected, in the form of Vincent Mad Dog Call, a young Irish gangster whose ruthlessness exceeded even Dutch's reputation for violence. Call's challenge would test every part of Dutch's organization and force him to face the reality that success in the criminal world always attracted those who wanted to take it away. The stage was set for the most violent period of Dutch's career, when his mathematical genius and organizational skills would be tested against an opponent who understood only brutality and had nothing to lose. The outcome would determine whether Dutch Schultz would continue his rise to the top of American organized crime, or whether he would become just another casualty of Prohibition's violent excesses. The stock market crash of October 1929 sent shockwaves through legitimate American business. But for Dutch Schultz, the economic disaster represented an amazing opportunity. While legal businesses struggled to survive the Great Depression, the demand for alcohol and the escape it provided stayed steady. More importantly, the economic crisis created a huge pool of unemployed men willing to work for criminal organizations that could still pay regular wages. Dutch recognized the moment as crucial. The established criminal organizations that had ruled New York for years were led by older men who had grown comfortable with their existing territories and profit levels. They were unprepared for the aggressive expansion that economic chaos would make possible. Dutch, at 27, had both the ambition and the strategic vision to seize the moment. His first move was to hire aggressively from the ranks of the newly unemployed. Former police officers, discharged soldiers, and bankrupt businessmen all found work with Dutch's organization. These men brought skills and connections that traditional street criminals lacked: knowledge of law enforcement procedures, military training, and understanding of legitimate business operations. Dutch fit these new recruits into his existing organization with his usual precision. Former police officers became intelligence operatives, gathering information about law enforcement activities and potential threats. Ex-soldiers were trained as enforcers, bringing discipline and tactical knowledge to Dutch's security operations. Bankrupt businessmen were assigned to manage the growing network of front companies that cleaned Dutch's illegal profits. By early 1930, Dutch commanded an organization of more than 800 men, larger than many legitimate corporations, and more disciplined than most police departments. The organization operated from a network of facilities throughout New York: warehouses, offices, garages, and safe houses, all coordinated from Dutch's central headquarters in the Bronx. Dutch's expansion inevitably brought him into conflict with other criminal organizations that viewed his growth as a threat to their own interests. The most dangerous of these challenges came from Vincent Mad Dog Call, a 21-year-old Irish gangster whose reputation for violence exceeded even Dutch's capacity for brutality. Call had grown up in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan, where he learned to survive through cunning, ruthlessness, and absolute fearlessness, unlike Dutch, who had developed sophisticated strategies for avoiding unnecessary conflicts. Call believed that a reputation for violence was the only thing that mattered in the criminal world. He had earned his nickname through a series of especially brutal murders that showed his willingness to kill anyone who opposed him. The conflict between Dutch and Call began over a relatively small territorial dispute. Call had been trying to push his way into several Manhattan speakeasies that were supplied by Dutch's organization. Rather than negotiating or compromising, Call had simply started hijacking Dutch's delivery trucks and threatening his customers. Dutch's first response was measured and strategic. He increased security for his delivery operations, offered alternative supply routes for threatened customers, and tried to negotiate a peaceful solution through go-betweens. But Call saw these efforts as weakness and stepped up his campaign against Dutch's organization. The turning point came in March 1930 when Call's men ambushed a Dutch Schultz delivery truck in broad daylight on a busy Manhattan street. The attack resulted in the deaths of 2 of Dutch's drivers and the theft of more than $10,000 worth of premium liquor. More importantly, The public nature of the attack was a direct challenge to Dutch's authority. It could not be ignored without making him look weak to other possible competitors. Dutch's response showed just how much he had changed from a street criminal to an organizational leader. Rather than launching an immediate and emotional revenge attack, he treated the conflict with Call as a business problem that needed a step-by-step solution. The first step was gathering information. Dutch assigned his best intelligence people to study Call's organization, identifying key people, operating methods, financial resources, and possible weak spots. Within weeks, Dutch had more detailed information about Call's activities than most police departments. The intelligence revealed that Call's organization was poorly structured and heavily dependent on Call's personal leadership, while Call himself was dangerous. His assistants lacked experience and discipline. Most importantly, Call's focus on violence over strategy had created many enemies who might be willing to team up with Dutch against a common threat. Dutch's strategy for dealing with Call involved multiple approaches at the same time, all designed to weaken his opponent while strengthening his own position. He began by approaching Call's enemies with alliance offers, giving them support in exchange for cooperation against Call. He also started a campaign of economic warfare, trying to cut off Call's sources of income and supply. At the same time, Dutch strengthened his own defenses. He hired extra bodyguards, armored his delivery vehicles, and set up secure communication systems that would allow him to coordinate his organization's activities, even under attack. These preparations showed Dutch's understanding that the conflict with Call would likely get worse and reach levels of violence never seen before. The escalation began in May 1930, when Dutch's men ambushed Call outside a Manhattan restaurant. The attack was carefully planned and carried out with military precision, but Call escaped with only minor wounds. His survival made him furious and convinced him that only Dutch's complete destruction would satisfy his need for revenge. Call's retaliation was swift and brutal. Over the next 2 weeks, he launched attacks on Dutch's operations throughout the city. Warehouses were firebombed, delivery trucks were machine-gunned, and several of Dutch's men were murdered in increasingly public displays of violence. The campaign reached its horrible peak on July 28, 1931, when Call's men opened fire on a group of children playing outside a Harlem apartment building where they believed Dutch's associates were meeting. The shooting killed a 5-year-old boy named Michael Vengali and wounded several other children. The incident shocked even New York's crime-hardened population and earned Call the nickname Baby Killer in newspaper headlines across the country. More importantly for Dutch, it gave him the reason he needed to take the conflict to its final conclusion. Dutch's response to the Vengali shooting showed his sophisticated understanding of both criminal warfare and public relations. Rather than simply launching violent revenge attacks, he created a campaign designed to destroy Call's reputation, while positioning himself as the lesser of two evils in the eyes of both the criminal world and law enforcement. Working through intermediaries, Dutch leaked information about Call's involvement in the shooting to newspaper reporters. He gave detailed accounts of Call's other violent crimes, painting him as an uncontrollable madman whose actions threatened the stability of the entire criminal underworld. At the same time, Dutch made it known that he was offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to Call's capture or death. The campaign was remarkably effective. Within weeks, Call found himself isolated from potential allies and targeted by bounty hunters throughout the city. Even criminals who had no particular loyalty to Dutch recognized that Call's reckless violence was bad for business and attracted unwanted law enforcement attention. But Dutch understood that public relations campaigns alone would not end the threat from Call. The Irish gangster remained dangerous as long as he was alive and free, and his desperation made him increasingly unpredictable. Dutch began planning Call's elimination with the same organized approach he applied to all business problems. The operation required months of preparation. Dutch's intelligence network tracked Call's movements, found his hiding places, and studied his security arrangements. They discovered that despite his reputation for fearlessness, Call had become increasingly paranoid and was constantly changing locations to avoid assassination attempts. Dutch's breakthrough came when his people learned that Call was planning to marry his girlfriend, Lottie Kreisberger. In a secret ceremony, a wedding would require Call to stay in one location for an extended period, creating the opportunity Dutch needed. On February 8, 1932, Vincent Call entered a phone booth outside a drugstore on West 23rd Street in Manhattan to make what would be his final phone call. As he spoke, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. 3 men got out, one carrying a Thompson submachine gun. They opened fire through the phone booth's glass panels, killing Call instantly. The killing was attributed to Dutch Schultz in every newspaper in the city, though Dutch was never formally charged with the crime. The killing marked the end of the most violent period in Dutch's career and established him as the undisputed master of organized crime in much of New York City. But Dutch's victory over Call came at a significant cost. The long conflict had used up enormous resources, disrupted business operations, and attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies. More importantly, it had shown that Dutch's empire, while powerful, was not untouchable. Dutch spent the rest of 1932 consolidating his position and rebuilding his organization. He replaced men lost during the conflict with Call, repaired damaged facilities, and strengthened security throughout his operations. But he also began branching out into different activities, recognizing that depending only on alcohol smuggling left him open to both competition and law enforcement pressure. The expansion began with moving into labor racketeering. Dutch's organization started offering protection services to construction companies, trucking firms, and restaurant owners. The protection was real. Businesses that paid Dutch's fees were kept safe from harassment by other criminals and received favorable treatment from corrupt officials. But companies that refused to pay faced steady harassment until they changed their minds. Dutch also expanded his gambling operations, setting up a network of poker games, dice games, and sports betting operations throughout the city. These activities generated good profits while needing relatively little infrastructure compared to alcohol smuggling. But Dutch's most significant new idea during this time was his development of sophisticated money laundering operations. As his illegal profits grew, he faced the challenge of turning criminal earnings into assets that could be safely kept and invested. Dutch's solution involved creating an elaborate network of shell companies, legitimate businesses, and financial investments. Illegal profits were fed through this network in complex patterns designed to hide where they came from while getting the best return on investment. The crown jewel of Dutch's money laundering empire was the Embassy Club, an exclusive Manhattan nightclub that served wealthy socialites, politicians, and businessmen. The club served as both a source of legitimate income and a way to clean illegal profits. More importantly, it gave Dutch access to influential people who could be cultivated as sources of information and protection. By the end of 1932, Dutch's transformation from street criminal to criminal executive was complete. At 30, he controlled an organization that made annual profits exceeding $5 million, employed more than 1,000 people, and operated legitimate businesses throughout New York City. He owned a mansion in the Bronx, a fleet of luxury automobiles, and investments in everything from real estate to Broadway shows. But Dutch understood that his success had also made him a target for the most dangerous opponent he would ever face, the federal government. The Roosevelt administration was preparing to end prohibition, which would eliminate Dutch's most profitable business. At the same time, new federal prosecutors were developing sophisticated strategies for attacking organized crime through tax evasion charges. The most dangerous of these prosecutors was Thomas E. Dewey, a young and ambitious lawyer who viewed the fight against organized crime as his path to political success. Dewey had studied Dutch's organization intensively and understood that traditional law enforcement methods would not be enough to bring down such a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The stage was set for the final act of Dutch Schultz's career, when his mathematical genius and organizational skills would be tested against the full power of the federal government. The outcome would determine whether Dutch could adapt to the changing criminal landscape of the 1930s, or whether his empire would become another casualty of America's evolving approach to fighting organized crime. The repeal of Prohibition in December 1933 represented the end of an era for American organized crime. But for Dutch Schultz, it marked the beginning of his greatest achievement. While other bootleggers struggled to adapt to the new legal situation, Dutch had expected the change and positioned his organization to take over an entirely different criminal enterprise, the numbers racket in Harlem. A numbers game was a form of illegal lottery that had existed in New York's African American communities. Since the early 1900s, players would bet small amounts, typically nickels, dimes, or quarters, on three-digit numbers, with winners determined by published financial statistics from the stock exchange or racetrack results. The odds against winning were enormous, 999 to 1. But the potential payoffs attracted thousands of daily players who saw the numbers as their only chance to escape poverty. What made the numbers racket especially attractive to Dutch was its mathematical foundation. Unlike bootlegging, which required complex logistics and constant risk of law enforcement interference, a numbers game was a pure probability business that could be made better through statistical analysis and superior organization. Dutch had first become aware of the numbers racket's potential in 1931 when his intelligence network reported that several Harlem operators were making good profits with relatively little overhead. While most criminals dismissed the numbers as a small-time operation, only suitable for street-level crooks, Dutch recognized its true potential. His analysis showed that the existing numbers operations in Harlem were inefficient and poorly organized. Most were run by individual operators who didn't have the money to pay large winners consistently or the mathematical knowledge to make their odds as good as possible. Players often faced delays in getting paid, arguments over winning numbers, and uncertainty about whether operators could cover big wins. Dutch saw an opportunity to apply the same organized approach that had made him successful in bootlegging. He would create a central numbers operation that offered players better service while making higher profits through mathematical precision and efficient operations. The challenge was taking over Harlem's numbers racket without starting a war with the operators already there. Dutch's solution showed his growing understanding of criminal strategy. Rather than just moving into Harlem with superior force, he would make himself essential to existing operators by providing services they couldn't get on their own. Dutch began by approaching Stephanie St. Clair, known as Queenie, or Madame Queen, who controlled the largest numbers operation in Harlem Street. Claire was a remarkable figure, a French-speaking immigrant from the Caribbean who had built her organization through intelligence, ruthlessness, and deep connections within Harlem's community. Dutch's proposal to St. Claire was, as always, sophisticated. He offered to give her operation better financial backing, which would allow her to pay larger winners without risking bankruptcy. He would also provide protection from police interference and access to sophisticated mathematical analysis that could make her profit margins as good as possible. In exchange, Dutch wanted a partnership that would give him access to St. Claire's knowledge of Harlem's numbers culture and her relationships with players and operators throughout the community. He understood that success in the numbers racket required cultural credibility that he, as a white gangster from the Bronx, could not achieve on his own street. Claire first rejected Dutch's proposal, seeing it as an attempt to take over her operation, but Dutch kept trying, showing the value he could provide through a series of small collaborations. When St. Claire faced a cash shortage that threatened her ability to pay winners, Dutch gave her emergency funds. When police pressure increased on her operations, Dutch used his connections to direct law enforcement attention elsewhere. Slowly, St. Claire began to appreciate the advantages of working with Dutch. His money allowed her to expand her operation significantly, while his protection removed many of the risks that had previously limited her growth. By late 1932, they had made their partnership official, with Dutch providing money and strategic support, while St. Claire kept operational control of day-to-day activities. The partnership's success encouraged other Harlem numbers operators to seek similar arrangements with Dutch. Within a year, he had set up financial relationships with nearly every significant numbers operation in the neighborhood. Each partnership was structured differently, but all involved Dutch providing money and protection in exchange for a percentage of profits. But Dutch's most important contribution to the Harlem numbers racket was his hiring of Otto Abadaba Berman, a mathematical genius who changed the entire operation. Berman was a certified public accountant who had turned to crime after losing his legitimate practice during the stock market crash. His understanding of statistics, probability, and financial manipulation was greater than anything the criminal world had seen before. Berman's arrival marked the beginning of Dutch's transformation of the numbers racket from a simple gambling operation into a sophisticated financial business. Working with Dutch, Berman developed mathematical models that made every part of the business as good as possible. Pricing strategies, payout schedules, and risk management systems. Their most creative development was a system for manipulating the published numbers that determined winning combinations, rather than relying on truly random results. Dutch and Berman found ways to influence the stock market figures and racetrack results used to create winning numbers. This manipulation allowed them to reduce payouts when too many players had bet on particular combinations. The manipulation required enormous sophistication and careful coordination. Berman would study betting patterns throughout the day to find out which numbers were getting heavy play. If too much money was bet on particular combinations, Dutch's people would take steps to make sure those numbers didn't win. The system was so effective that Dutch's numbers operations achieved profit margins significantly higher than traditional operators. While most numbers games operated on margins of 20 to 30%, Dutch's operations achieved margins exceeding 40% through better mathematical analysis and systematic manipulation. By 1934, Dutch controlled the most profitable numbers operation in the history of American organized crime. His Harlem empire made daily profits exceeding $10,000, more than $200,000 in today's money, while employing hundreds of people and serving thousands of daily customers. But Dutch's success in the numbers racket also created new challenges. The operation's visibility and profitability attracted attention from both rival criminals and law enforcement agencies. Most dangerously, it brought Dutch into direct conflict with Lucky Luciano and the emerging commission system that was trying to organize American crime along corporate lines. Luciano viewed Dutch's independent success as a threat to the cooperative approach he was trying to establish among New York's crime families. The commission system required major criminal operations to coordinate their activities and respect territorial boundaries established through negotiation rather than force. Dutch's Harlem numbers empire violated these principles in several ways. It operated in territory that other crime families considered their own, generated profits that weren't shared with other organizations, and showed that successful criminal enterprises could exist outside the Commission's control. The conflict came to a head in early 1934 when Luciano called Dutch to a meeting at a Brooklyn restaurant. The meeting was attended by representatives of all 5 New York crime families, as well as visitors from criminal organizations in other cities. Luciano's message was direct. Dutch would need to fit his operations into the commission system or face the combined opposition of organized crime throughout the United States. The numbers racket would be divided among the 5 families, with Dutch receiving a share proportional to his current investment. Dutch's response showed his supreme confidence and his growing contempt for collaborative approaches to criminal enterprise. He rejected Luciano's proposal completely, arguing that his mathematical and organizational superiority had created value that couldn't be achieved through committee management. "You guys have been running crime like it's still 1900, Dutch told the assembled crime bosses. "I'm running it like it's 1934. There's room for both approaches. But don't expect me to pretend. Your way is better just because it's older." The confrontation established Dutch as the main opponent of the commission system and marked the beginning of his isolation from the broader organized crime community. But it also showed his confidence that superior intelligence and organization could overcome numerical disadvantages. Dutch's confidence was based on more than just bravado. By 1934, his combined operations made annual profits exceeding $20 million, making him one of the wealthiest criminals in American history. More importantly, his organized approach to crime had created an organization that was more efficient and profitable than traditional crime family structures. But Dutch's greatest achievement during this time was his development of what he called arithmetic gangsterism, a complete approach to criminal enterprise based on mathematical analysis rather than traditional intimidation and violence. Arithmetic gangsterism involved the systematic application of statistical analysis, financial modeling, and operational research to criminal activities. Dutch studied every part of his operations with scientific precision, finding opportunities for improvement that traditional criminals missed. The approach extended beyond the numbers racket to all of Dutch's activities. His remaining bootlegging operations were made better through route analysis and demand forecasting. His labor racketeering activities were structured using economic models that got the most cooperation while costing the least to enforce. Even his money laundering operations were designed using mathematical principles that made detection as unlikely as possible, while making investment returns as high as possible. By the end of 1934, Dutch Schultz had created something never seen before in American organized crime, a criminal empire based on intellectual superiority rather than physical force. His organization made more profit per employee than most legitimate corporations, operated with lower overhead costs than traditional crime families, and achieved customer satisfaction levels that exceeded many legal businesses. But Dutch's intellectual approach to crime had also created weaknesses that traditional gangsters didn't have. His operations required sophisticated record keeping that could provide evidence for law enforcement investigations. His mathematical optimization systems created patterns that skilled prosecutors could find and use. Most dangerously, his success had attracted the attention of Thomas E. Dewey, a prosecutor who combined traditional investigative methods with new approaches, specifically designed to fight organized crime. The stage was set for the greatest challenge of Dutch's career, when his mathematical genius would be tested against the full investigative power of the federal government. The outcome would determine whether intellectual superiority could overcome the systematic approach that Dewey was developing to destroy organized crime in America. Thomas Edmund Dewey was everything Dutch Schultz was not, and everything Dutch had learned to fear. Where Dutch was a product of the streets, who had educated himself in the brutal realities of criminal survival, Dewey was a privileged son of the American establishment, who had attended the finest schools and trained in the most prestigious law firms. Where Dutch operated through corruption and intimidation, Dewey wielded the moral authority of legitimate government and the investigative power of federal law enforcement. But what made Dewey truly dangerous was his understanding that traditional law enforcement methods were not enough against sophisticated criminal organizations. He had studied Dutch's empire with the same analytical intensity that Dutch applied to his own operations, and he had developed strategies specifically designed to attack the weaknesses created by Dutch's organized approach to crime. Dewey's appointment as special prosecutor in 1935 represented a new phase in the government's war against organized crime. Previous prosecutors had relied mainly on infiltration, surveillance, and witness testimony, approaches that were easily countered by criminals who understood the system. Dewey brought a more sophisticated understanding of how to attack criminal organizations through their financial operations. His strategy focused on three main weaknesses in Dutch's empire: the extensive record keeping required by mathematical optimization, the large number of employees who could provide testimony, and the complex financial transactions that could be traced through systematic investigation. Dutch first underestimated Dewey, seeing him as just another prosecutor who could be neutralized through corruption or intimidation. This judgment proved to be one of the most serious mistakes of Dutch's career. Dutch's first attempt to deal with Dewey followed his usual approach, finding the prosecutor's weaknesses and developing strategies to use them. His intelligence network investigated Dewey's personal life, financial situation, and political ambitions, looking for leverage that could be used to influence or neutralize him. The investigation showed that Dewey was genuinely incorruptible, a rare thing among public officials in 1930s New York. He had significant personal wealth that made him immune to financial temptation, and his political ambitions were based on his reputation for honesty rather than his willingness to compromise with criminal interests. More troubling for Dutch, the investigation showed that Dewey understood organized crime better than any previous prosecutor. He had studied the business structures of major criminal organizations, identifying their operating methods, financial practices, and strategic weaknesses. His prosecution strategy was based on this analytical understanding rather than traditional law enforcement intuition. Dutch's second approach to the Dewey problem involved trying to undermine the prosecutor's investigation through systematic obstruction. Dutch's sources within law enforcement gave early warning of planned raids, surveillance operations, and witness interviews. This intelligence allowed Dutch to move evidence, relocate people, and prepare defense strategies before Dewey's investigators arrived. But Dewey had expected this obstruction and had developed counter-strategies that reduced Dutch's advantages. He separated his investigation into parts, limiting access to sensitive information and using multiple investigation teams that operated independently. He also used new surveillance techniques that were hard to detect and counter. Most importantly, Dewey focused his investigation on areas where Dutch's mathematical optimization created permanent records that couldn't be destroyed or hidden. The numbers racket, in particular, required extensive documentation to work effectively. Otto Berman's mathematical models, profit calculations, and operational analyses provided a detailed blueprint of Dutch's entire operation. By late 1934, Dewey's investigation had gathered evidence that could support multiple federal charges against Dutch and his key associates. The evidence included financial records showing illegal income, testimony from employees willing to cooperate with prosecutors, and surveillance materials showing the scope of Dutch's operations. Dutch's response to this mounting pressure showed both his strategic brilliance and his basic character flaws. Rather than accepting that prosecution was unavoidable and trying to negotiate a plea deal, Dutch began planning the most daring solution of his career, the assassination of Thomas E. Dewey. The decision to target Dewey represented a huge departure from Dutch's previous approach to law enforcement problems. Throughout his career, he had avoided violence against government officials, understanding that such attacks would bring retaliation that could destroy his organization. But Dutch's growing paranoia and his refusal to accept defeat led him to conclude that eliminating Dewey was his only option. Dutch's assassination plan showed the same analytical precision he applied to all his operations. His intelligence network studied Dewey's daily routines, security arrangements, and travel patterns. They found multiple opportunities for attack and developed detailed backup plans for different scenarios. The plan that Dutch finally chose involved attacking Dewey as he left his apartment, building each morning for his downtown office. Dutch's gunman would wait in a stolen car across the street from Dewey's residence, then open fire as the prosecutor came out. The attack would be quick and decisive, allowing the killers to escape before police could respond. But Dutch's plan to kill Dewey created a problem that his analytical mind hadn't fully considered: the reaction of other organized crime leaders to such an unheard-of attack on federal law enforcement. Lucky Luciano and the Commission viewed Dutch's assassination plan as a threat to the entire criminal underworld. They understood that killing a federal prosecutor would bring government retaliation that could destroy organized crime throughout the United States. The murder of Thomas Dewey would justify any level of federal response, including martial law, mass arrests, and suspension of constitutional protections. Luciano's opposition to Dutch's plan was both practical and strategic. He recognized that Dutch's mathematical approach to crime had created unheard-of wealth and efficiency. But he also understood that Dutch's arrogance and independence made him a danger to organized crime as a whole. The Commission's response to Dutch's assassination plan would determine not only Dutch's fate, but also the future structure of American organized crime. The decision they made would establish whether criminal organizations would be allowed to operate independently or whether all major criminal activities would be coordinated through central authority. The Commission met in October 1935 to consider the Dutch Schultz problem. The meeting was attended by representatives of all 5 New York crime families, as well as leaders from criminal organizations in Chicago, Philadelphia, and other major cities. The debate centered on 2 basic questions: whether Dutch's plan to kill Dewey posed an unacceptable threat to organized crime, and whether Dutch himself had become too dangerous to remain in operation. Luciano argued forcefully that Dutch's assassination plan would bring government retaliation that could destroy organized crime throughout the United States. He pointed out that Dutch's refusal to cooperate with the Commission system made him a danger that the organization could no longer afford. Other commission members raised concerns about the precedent that would be set by authorizing Dutch's assassination. If the commission could order the death of one boss for acting independently, what would stop similar orders against other leaders who disagreed with majority decisions? But Luciano's argument finally won. The commission concluded that Dutch's plan to kill Dewey posed such a serious threat to organized crime that his elimination was justified as an act of collective self-defense. The vote to kill Dutch Schultz was unanimous. The commission's decision marked the end of the era of independent criminal enterprises and the beginning of the central system that would dominate American organized crime for the next 50 years. Dutch's mathematical genius and organizational brilliance had created unheard of success, but his refusal to submit to group authority had made him a victim of the system he had helped to create. But Dutch remained unaware of the commission's decision as he finalized his plans to assassinate Thomas Dewey. His intelligence network, which had served him so well throughout his career, failed to detect the threat that was approaching from within the criminal world he had dominated. On the evening of October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz drove to the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, for what he thought was a routine meeting with his associates. He had no way of knowing that the commission's assassins were already in position, waiting for the moment when the most brilliant criminal mind of his generation would be silenced forever. The stage was set for the final act of Dutch Schultz's extraordinary career, when the mathematical genius who had changed organized crime would face the ultimate equation, the one that would balance his life against the shared interests of the criminal world he had tried to conquer. The Palace Chop House, a plain tavern in Newark, New Jersey, was an unlikely place for the end of one of America's most extraordinary criminal careers. Located on Park Street in a working-class Italian neighborhood, the restaurant served simple food to local families and provided a quiet place for businessmen seeking privacy for sensitive conversations. It was this reputation for discretion that had attracted Dutch Schultz to use it as a meeting place with his closest associates. On the evening of October 23, 1935, Dutch arrived at the Palace Chop House at about 9:30 p.m., accompanied by his three most trusted lieutenants. Otto Abadaba Berman, a mathematical genius who had changed Dutch's numbers operations, carried with him a briefcase containing the latest profit calculations and operational analyses. Abe Landau and Lulu Rosenkrantz, Dutch's longtime bodyguards and enforcers, positioned themselves strategically to watch the restaurant's entrances and exits. The meeting's agenda was, as usual, thorough. Dutch wanted to review the week's numbers receipts, discuss security arrangements for several operations facing police pressure, and finalize plans for the Thomas Dewey assassination. Despite mounting pressure from law enforcement and rumors of threats from rival criminals, Dutch remained confident that his superior intelligence and organization would overcome any challenges. What Dutch didn't know was that Lucky Luciano's assassins were already in position. The commission's decision to eliminate Dutch had been carried out with military precision, using intelligence sources within Dutch's organization to track his movements and find the best moment for attack. The assassination team consisted of 4 men, each chosen for specific skills that would be needed for the operation. Charles "the Bug" Workman served as the main gunman, a professional killer with a reputation for efficiency and reliability. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss provided backup firepower and surveillance. 2 additional men waited outside in a stolen car, ready to provide covering fire and ensure a quick escape. The plan was simple and elegant. The gunmen would enter the restaurant during the dinner rush, when many customers would provide confusion and cover. They would identify Dutch and his associates. kill all 4 men quickly and escape before police could respond. The timing would make the murders look like a random gang shooting rather than a carefully planned commission operation. At about 10:15 p.m., Workman and Weiss entered the Palace Chop House. They had studied photographs of Dutch and his associates, and they immediately found their targets sitting in a booth near the back of the restaurant. Dutch sat with his back to the wall, a habit born from years of survival in the underworld. Berman sat across from him, reviewing financial documents by the dim light of a table lamp. Landau and Rosenkrantz sat on either side, their eyes constantly scanning the restaurant for potential threats. The gunmen approached with practiced casualness, their weapons hidden beneath dark overcoats. Other diners paid them no attention. Men in overcoats were common sights in New York restaurants during the cool October evening. When the shooting began, it lasted less than 30 seconds. Workman opened fire first, his .38 caliber revolver spitting flame in the restaurant's amber light. Dutch, hit in the abdomen, doubled over, but remained conscious. Berman, hit in the neck, collapsed immediately. Landau and Rosenkrantz, despite their reputations as deadly gunmen, were caught completely off guard and fell within seconds. The other restaurant patrons screamed and dove for cover as the gunmen kept firing. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood filled the air as bullets missed their intended targets and hit walls, mirrors, and furniture. But the assassination, despite its careful planning, was not perfectly carried out. Dutch, though fatally wounded, remained alive and conscious. His mathematical mind, even in its final moments, continued to work with sharp precision as the gunmen fled and chaos erupted around him. Dutch began speaking words that would become the most famous dying declaration in American criminal history. The first police officers arrived within minutes of the shooting, followed quickly by detectives and medical workers. They found a scene of devastation. Berman and Landau were dead, Rosenkrantz was dying, and Dutch was conscious, but rapidly losing blood from massive abdominal wounds. Dutch was rushed to Newark City Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. The wounds were severe. Bullets had torn through his stomach, intestines, and liver, but Dutch's strong body and fierce will to live kept him conscious for nearly 24 hours after the shooting. It was during these final hours that Dutch spoke the words that would make him immortal in American folklore. Delirious with pain and morphine, he rambled on, not making much sense about his life, his crimes, and his fears. A police stenographer, F.J. Long, recorded every word, creating a written record that would fascinate criminologists, psychiatrists, and literary scholars for decades. "A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 kim," Dutch muttered, his eyes unfocused, but his voice surprisingly clear. "You can play jacks, and girls do that with a softball and do tricks with it. Oh, dog biscuit, and when he is happy, he doesn't get snappy." The words seemed to make no sense, but some observers thought they might contain hidden meanings, perhaps references to hidden money or coded messages about his organization's operations. Others saw them as the fevered ramblings of a dying brain, important only as a glimpse into the psychological state of one of America's most complex criminals. The sidewalk was in trouble, and the bears were in trouble, and I broke it up, Dutch continued. Please, I am getting my wind back. Thank God. Please put me up, my friends. Please look out. The shooting is a bit wild, and that kind of shooting saved a man's life. The references to sidewalk and bears might have related to his business operations. Sidewalk could refer to street-level activities, while bears might indicate financial troubles or stock market concerns. But the meanings remained unclear, adding to the legend that would grow around Dutch's final hours. Throughout the night, Dutch drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking clearly about his past, sometimes mumbling about things that no one could understand. He spoke of his mother, his childhood, his associates, and his fears about the future. Mother is the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast, he said at one point, perhaps reflecting on the religious training of his youth and his mother's attempts to keep him on the straight path. The reference to Satan might have been a recognition of the evil he had embraced throughout his criminal career. As dawn approached, Dutch's condition got worse quickly. His voice grew weaker, his periods of consciousness shorter, and his words more disconnected. But even in his final moments, he kept speaking, as if trying to communicate something important about his life and experiences. French-Canadian bean soup, he whispered near the end, a phrase that confused everyone present, but might have referred to childhood memories or some private joke from his criminal career. At 8:35 a.m. on October 24, 1935, Dutch Schultz died without revealing the location of his hidden assets or providing any clear explanation of his final words. A mathematical genius who had changed American organized crime was gone, but the mystery of his dying words would make sure he was never forgotten in criminal folklore. The immediate aftermath of Dutch's death showed just how much his organization depended on his personal leadership. Without Dutch's analytical mind and strategic vision, his empire fell apart within weeks. Otto Berman's death had taken away the mathematical expertise that made the numbers operation so profitable, and the loss of Landau and Rosencrantz left the organization without experienced leadership. Lucky Luciano moved quickly to take control of Dutch's operations, especially the profitable Harlem numbers racket. But even Luciano's organization couldn't match the mathematical sophistication that had made Dutch's operations so profitable. The numbers business continued, but never again achieved the efficiency and profitability that Dutch and Berman had created. Thomas E. Dewey, ironically, benefited most from Dutch's death. The elimination of his most dangerous target improved Dewey's reputation and gave him political support that would eventually carry him to the New York governor's mansion and 2 presidential nominations. The man who might have been killed by Dutch's assassins instead became one of the most famous political figures of his generation. But perhaps the most significant result of Dutch's death was its effect on the structure of American organized crime. The Commission's successful elimination of an independent criminal leader established the rule that would control organized crime for the next 50 years. Individual brilliance and independence would be put under group authority and coordinated action. Dutch Schultz had been the last of the independent criminal entrepreneurs, a man whose intellectual gifts and organizational genius had allowed him to compete successfully against entire crime families. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of the corporate approach to organized crime that would dominate American criminal enterprises until the 1980s. The Commission had solved the Dutch Schultz problem, but in doing so, they had also eliminated the kind of creative thinking that had made Dutch so successful. Future criminal organizations would be more stable and cooperative, but they would never again achieve the mathematical precision and analytical sophistication that had made Dutch Schultz the most profitable criminal in American history. The bright lights of Newark City Hospital cast sharp shadows across Dutch Schultz's pale face as he lay dying on the narrow hospital bed. Police stenographer F.J. Long sat beside him, pencil ready over his notebook, writing down every word that came from the lips of one of America's most famous criminals. The doctors had done what they could, but the huge internal damage caused by the assassin's bullets was beyond repair. Dutch Schultz, the mathematical genius of organized crime, had perhaps 24 hours left to live as morphine flowed through his system. Fighting a losing battle against the pain spreading from his shattered abdomen, Dutch's mind wandered through 33 years of memories. The abandoned boy from the Bronx, the teenage gang leader, the bootlegger, the numbers king. All of these identities mixed together in his mind as death approached. Please, please, I am getting my wind back. Thank God, Dutch whispered, his voice barely audible above the hospital's mechanical sounds. Please put me up, my friends. Please look out. The shooting is a bit wild, and that kind of shooting saved a man's life. The irony wasn't lost on him, even in his confusion. The kind of shooting he mentioned had been his life's work, the planned use of violence to achieve business goals. Now he was dying from that same violence used against him with the precision he had taught the criminal world. The sidewalk was in trouble, and the bears were in trouble, and I broke it up, he continued, perhaps referring to his role in settling disputes between criminal organizations or to the stock market tricks that had helped make his numbers operation so profitable. Even while dying, Dutch's mind worked in the mathematical comparisons that had defined his approach to crime. Stenographer Long wrote furiously, trying to capture every word. He didn't understand the importance of what he was recording, but he sensed that history was speaking through the lips of this dying gangster. These weren't just the ramblings of a mind clouded by morphine. They were the final thoughts of a man who had changed American organized crime. You can play jacks, and girls do that with a softball and do tricks with it, Dutch mumbled, perhaps remembering his childhood on the streets of the Bronx, when life was simpler and his future seemed to hold endless possibilities. Oh, dog biscuit, and when he is happy, he doesn't get snappy. The reference to childhood games was touching. Dutch Schultz had never really been allowed to be a child. His father's abandonment when he was 8 had forced him to become the man of the house, to learn survival skills that would help him throughout his criminal career. The dog biscuit reference might have been a memory of a pet or a coded reference to loyalty, the kind of unquestioning devotion he had demanded from his associates and had given to his mother as the night went on. Dutch's rambling became more intense, more urgent, as if he was trying to communicate something important about his life and experiences. The morphine created a half-awake state where past and present mixed together, where the mathematical precision that had defined his career gave way to pure emotion and memory. Mother is the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast, he whispered, his voice getting stronger for a moment. This was perhaps the most revealing statement of his entire dying declaration. Throughout his criminal career, Dutch had kept an almost sacred devotion to his mother. Emma, she had been his moral anchor, the one person who could call him Arthur instead of Dutch, who could remind him of the boy he had been before the streets claimed him. The reference to Satan was equally telling, despite his crimes. Dutch had never completely given up the religious training of his youth. His mother had been deeply religious, and some part of him had always understood that his chosen path was leading him toward damnation. The warning about Satan drawing too fast might have been advice to himself, or to others about the tempting power of criminal success. Please crack down on the Chinaman's friends and Hitler's commander, Dutch said, his mind now jumping between different enemies and threats. The Chinaman might have referred to one of his criminal rivals, while Hitler's commander could have been a reference to law enforcement officials or federal agents. Even while dying, Dutch's strategic mind was listing threats and planning responses. But it was his next series of statements that would create the most speculation and analysis from future criminologists and treasure hunters. A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 kim. Did you hear me? A boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 kim. The repetition suggested this was important to Dutch, but the meaning remained unclear. Some would later think that kim was a mix-up for grand or gems, and that Dutch was trying to reveal the location of hidden assets. Others thought it was pure confusion, the random firing of neurons in a dying brain. I am a pretty good pretzler, Wilfred. Why don't you go ahead for last week? Dutch continued, perhaps referring to business associates or financial arrangements. The pretzler reference might have been his way of describing his ability to twist situations to his advantage, to find complex solutions to difficult problems. As dawn approached, Dutch's condition got worse quickly. His breathing became labored, his skin took on a gray color, and his periods of consciousness grew shorter. But even as his body failed, his mind kept working, processing 3 decades of experiences and trying to make sense of his extraordinary life. The sidewalk was in trouble, and the bears were in trouble. And I broke it up, he repeated, perhaps referring to his role as a mediator in criminal disputes. Throughout his career, Dutch had often served as a problem solver, using his analytical skills to solve conflicts that threatened the stability of organized crime operations. Please help me up. Henry, Max, come over here. French-Canadian bean soup, he mumbled, calling out to associates, both living and dead. The French-Canadian bean soup reference was especially touching. It might have been a childhood memory, a reference to his mother's cooking, or simply the wandering of a mind no longer tied to rational thought. But perhaps Dutch's most significant dying statement was his reference to his organization's future. I don't want to holler. A glove will fit what I say. Okay, sure. Who cares when you are through? How do you know this? The glove will fit reference might have been Dutch's way of saying that his predictions about organized crime's future would prove correct. He had always understood that the criminal world was moving toward greater organization and cooperation, and his death would speed up that change at 8:35 a.m. On October 24, 1935, Dutch Schultz took his last breath. The mathematical genius who had changed American organized crime was gone, but the legend of his dying words would live forever. Dr. Cornelius Reisman, who had overseen Dutch's medical care during his final hours, later described the experience as one of the most extraordinary of his career. He was a remarkable man, Reisman said, even dying. He kept a dignity and intelligence that was quite impressive. Whatever else he may have been, Dutch Schultz was no ordinary criminal. The immediate aftermath of Dutch's death showed the true extent of his influence on American organized crime. Within hours of his passing, representatives from crime families throughout the country began arriving in New York to discuss how to divide up his empire. Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and other commission members moved quickly to prevent a power vacuum that could lead to violent conflicts. But they discovered that Dutch's organization couldn't simply be taken over by other crime families. His mathematical approach to criminal enterprise had created systems and procedures that were too complex for traditional gangsters to understand or maintain. Otto Berman's death had taken away the mathematical expertise necessary to continue the numbers operations at their previous level of profitability. Within weeks, Dutch's empire had mostly fallen apart. His numbers operations were divided among existing crime families, but they never again achieved the efficiency and profitability that Dutch and Berman had created. His bootlegging operations were stopped as Prohibition ended, and his labor racketeering activities were absorbed into existing territorial arrangements. Most sadly, Dutch's new ideas in criminal organization were mostly forgotten. Future crime leaders would focus on keeping stability and avoiding conflicts rather than pursuing the kind of analytical optimization that had made Dutch so successful. The commission system that emerged after Dutch's death emphasized cooperation and agreement over individual brilliance and innovation. Thomas E. Dewey, ironically, became the greatest beneficiary of Dutch's death. The elimination of his most dangerous target improved Dewey's reputation as an honest prosecutor and gave him the political support necessary for his later career. He would go on to become governor of New York and the Republican nominee for president in both 1944 and 1948. But perhaps the most significant result of Dutch's death was its effect on American organized crime itself. The Commission's decision to eliminate Dutch had established the rule that individual genius and independence would be put under group authority and coordinated action. This rule would control organized crime for the next 50 years, creating more stable but less creative criminal organizations. Dutch Schultz had been the last of the great independent criminal entrepreneurs, a man whose intellectual gifts had allowed him to compete successfully against entire crime families. His mathematical approach to criminal enterprise had created unheard-of profits while keeping violence and law enforcement attention to a minimum. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a more corporate but less creative approach to organized crime. The legend of Dutch Schultz's dying words would last long after his death, inspiring treasure hunters, criminologists, and amateur detectives to search for hidden meanings in his rambling statements. Some claim to have figured out his references to hidden money, while others saw them as pure confusion, the truth. Like so much about Dutch Schultz's extraordinary life, remained forever a mystery. But beyond the speculation about hidden treasures and coded messages, Dutch's final words showed something deep about the man himself. Even while dying, he remained concerned about his associates, his mother, and his organization's future. The mathematical genius who had changed organized crime had never lost his basic humanity. In death, as in life, Dutch Schultz remained a puzzle, a man who had combined ruthless criminality with genuine intelligence, brutal efficiency with personal loyalty, and mathematical precision with human emotion. His story served as a reminder that even in the darkest corners of American society, extraordinary individuals could rise to positions of influence and power through intelligence, determination, and sheer force of will. The Palace Chop House shooting had ended more than just Dutch Schultz's life. It had marked the end of organized crime's entrepreneurial age and the beginning of its corporate era. Never again would individual criminals achieve the kind of independent success that Dutch had built through analytical thinking and systematic organization. As Dutch's body was prepared for burial, law enforcement officials and rival criminals alike struggled to understand the full importance of what had been lost. They had eliminated a dangerous criminal, but they had also destroyed something unique in American organized crime, a mind capable of seeing beyond traditional approaches and creating entirely new possibilities for criminal enterprise. The funeral of Dutch Schultz was attended by hundreds of mourners, from his elderly mother Emma to powerful crime bosses who had ordered his death. The contradictions built into his life were reflected in the variety of those who came to pay their respects. Here was a man who had been loved and feared, respected and despised, understood and misunderstood by all who knew him. Emma Flegenhammer, now in her 70s and broken by the loss of her son, spoke briefly to reporters about the boy she had raised and the man he had become. "Arthur was always such a good boy to me," she said, using his birth name, as she had throughout his criminal career. "He took care of me when his father left us. I know he did bad things, but he was always my son." Her words captured the essential sadness of Dutch Schultz's story, The abandoned boy who had turned to crime to support his mother had become one of America's most feared criminals. But he had never lost his ability to love and be loyal. His criminal genius had been built on a foundation of childhood pain and desperate need, creating a man who could order killings while quietly paying for neighbors' groceries. As Dutch's casket was lowered into the ground, those present understood that they were watching the end of an era. The age of independent criminal entrepreneurs was over, replaced by the corporate structures that would control organized crime for generations to come. The mathematical precision and analytical innovation that Dutch had brought to criminal enterprise would be remembered only in legend and whispered stories. But Dutch Schultz's greatest legacy wasn't his criminal achievements or his mysterious dying words. It was his demonstration that intelligence and determination could overcome any disadvantage, that systematic thinking could beat traditional approaches, and that even in the criminal underworld, individual brilliance could reshape entire industries. The boy who had been abandoned on the streets of the Bronx had turned himself into the most successful criminal of his generation. His empire had generated wealth that exceeded the dreams of legitimate businessmen, employed thousands of people, and influenced the development of American organized crime for decades. Dutch Schultz's story was ultimately a twisted version of the American dream, a tale of how intelligence, ambition, and ruthless determination could create extraordinary success even when applied to criminal enterprise. His death marked not just the end of a remarkable life, but the end of organized crime's most innovative and profitable era. The mathematical genius was gone, but his influence would last in the structure and methods of American organized crime. Future generations of criminals would benefit from the organizational innovations he had created, even as they forgot the brilliant mind that had made them. In the end, Dutch Schultz had achieved a kind of immortality that escaped most criminals and legitimate businessmen alike. His name would be remembered, his methods studied, and his story told as long as people remained fascinated by the mix of genius and criminality in American history. The Palace Chop House shooting had ended Dutch Schultz's life, but it had made sure he would always have a place in the collection of American criminal legends. The abandoned boy from the Bronx had become the beer baron of New York, the numbers king of Harlem, and finally the most analytically brilliant criminal mind of his generation. As the last mourners left the cemetery and the reporters finished their stories, Dutch Schultz's transformation was complete. He had changed from Arthur Flegenheimer to Dutch Schultz to legend, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire criminologists, fascinate historians, and captivate anyone interested in the darker possibilities of American ambition. The mathematical genius of organized crime was dead, but his equations would keep balancing in the criminal underworld for generations to come. Dutch Schultz had solved the ultimate problem of his chosen profession: how to be remembered forever. The death of Dutch Schultz on October 24, 1935, marked more than the end of one man's extraordinary criminal career. It represented the end of organized crime's entrepreneurial age and the beginning of its corporate era. In the decades that followed, as America changed from a Prohibition-era nation to a global superpower, the methods and innovations that Dutch had started would influence criminal organizations throughout the world. Even as his name faded from popular memory within months of Dutch's death, law enforcement officials began to understand the full scope of what they had lost. The fall of Dutch's organization gave them an unprecedented look into the mathematical sophistication he had brought to criminal enterprise. Otto Berman's seized records showed complex statistical models, probability calculations, and optimization formulas that exceeded the analytical abilities of most legitimate businesses. Thomas E. Dewey, whose career had been made by his pursuit of Dutch Schultz, would later admit the unique challenge that Dutch had represented. He was unlike any criminal we had ever met, Dewey wrote in his memoirs. Most gangsters relied on violence and intimidation. Dutch Schultz relied on his mind, in many ways. That made him far more dangerous than any gunman or enforcer. The commission system that emerged after Dutch's elimination would control American organized crime until the 1980s. But it never again produced the kind of individual brilliance that Dutch had shown. Future crime bosses would focus on keeping stability and avoiding conflicts rather than pursuing the analytical innovations that had made Dutch's operations so profitable. Lucky Luciano, who had arranged Dutch's assassination, would later express private regret about the decision. Dutch was a pain in the ass, he told associates years later, but he was also a genius. We might have learned something from him if we hadn't been so worried about our own territories. The mathematical approach to criminal enterprise that Dutch had started wouldn't reappear until the 1970s, when a new generation of criminals began using computer technology and advanced statistical analysis for illegal activities. Drug cartels, financial fraudsters, and cyber criminals would unknowingly follow the path that Dutch had blazed 4 decades earlier, using analytical thinking to make illegal operations as profitable as possible. But perhaps Dutch's greatest legacy was his demonstration that intelligence could beat traditional advantages in any field, including crime. The abandoned boy from the Bronx had shown that systematic thinking, mathematical analysis, and organizational innovation could overcome larger numbers, established connections, and even government opposition. His story became a warning about the dangerous possibilities of American ambition. Dutch Schultz had achieved everything the American dream promised: wealth, power, and influence, but he had achieved it through methods that ultimately destroyed him. His mathematical genius had created unheard-of success, but it had also created the enemies and pressures that led to his death. The mystery of Dutch's dying words continued to fascinate treasure hunters and amateur code breakers for decades after his death. Dozens of books and articles tried to figure out his final statements, searching for clues about hidden money or secret information. But the real treasure that Dutch left behind wasn't buried gold or hidden cash. It was the intellectual framework he had created for understanding criminal enterprise as a business that could be made better through mathematical optimization. Modern law enforcement agencies still study Dutch's methods as an example of how intelligent criminals can use weaknesses in legal and regulatory structures. His innovations in money laundering, organizational management, and corruption networks gave a blueprint that could be followed by criminal organizations throughout the world. The FBI's Organized Crime Unit keeps extensive files on Dutch Schultz, not because of his historical importance, but because his methods are still relevant to modern criminal investigations. He was ahead of his time, explained one federal agent. The techniques he developed in the 1930s are still being used by sophisticated criminal organizations today. Academic criminologists have identified Dutch as a key figure in the evolution of organized crime, from traditional gang structures to modern corporate models. His systematic approach to criminal enterprise influenced the development of drug cartels, financial fraud networks, and international criminal organizations that operate with the efficiency and sophistication of multinational corporations. But beyond his influence on criminal methods, Dutch Schultz's story serves as a reminder of the complex factors that shape individual lives in America. The combination of abandonment, poverty, intelligence, and opportunity that created Dutch Schultz still exists in modern American society, creating new generations of individuals who must choose between legitimate and criminal paths to success. The neighborhoods where Dutch grew up the South Bronx tenements where Arthur Flegenheimer learned to survive, still produce young people who face similar choices between conventional education and street education, between honest work and criminal opportunity. Some choose differently than Dutch did, but others follow similar paths, using intelligence and determination to build criminal enterprises that echo his innovations. Dutch's relationship with his mother, Emma, which remained devoted throughout his criminal career, shows the complex moral landscape that criminals move through. Even the most brutal criminals often keep connections to regular society through family relationships, charity work, and community involvement. Dutch's ability to separate his criminal activities while keeping genuine human connections showed a psychological complexity that challenged simple labels of good and evil. The economic lessons of Dutch's career are still relevant to modern discussions about inequality, opportunity, and social mobility in America. His change from poverty to wealth showed both the possibilities and the dangers of American capitalism when pursued outside legal boundaries. The efficiency and profitability of his criminal enterprise raised uncomfortable questions about the relative effectiveness of legal and illegal approaches to creating wealth. Dutch's mathematical approach to crime also predicted the role that technology and data analysis would play in 21st century criminal enterprises. Modern cyber criminals, financial fraudsters, and drug traffickers use complex computer models and statistical analysis to make their operations as profitable as possible in ways that directly copy Dutch's innovations from the 1930s. The globalization of criminal enterprise that began in the late 20th century followed organizational models that Dutch had started decades earlier. International criminal organizations use the same principles of systematic planning, mathematical optimization, and corporate structure that Dutch had developed for his New York empire. But perhaps most importantly, Dutch Schultz's story serves as a reminder that individual brilliance can come from the most unlikely circumstances and influence fields far beyond their original application. The mathematical genius who changed organized crime in 1930s New York created intellectual frameworks that would influence criminal organizations throughout the world for generations to come. His legacy lives on, not in hidden treasure or decoded messages, but in the basic understanding that criminal enterprise, like any other business activity, can be made better through analytical optimization and systematic improvement. This insight, born from the desperate need of an abandoned child in the Bronx, would reshape organized crime throughout the world and give law enforcement both challenges and opportunities that continue to this day. The boy who became Dutch Schultz had solved the ultimate equation of his chosen profession: how to turn intelligence into power, analysis into wealth, and systematic thinking into criminal empire. His death had ended his personal story, but his methods would continue to influence the criminal underworld long after his name was forgotten by the general public. In the end, Dutch Schultz achieved the immortality that had always escaped him in life, not through violence or intimidation, but through the power of ideas that went beyond their criminal origins to influence fields as diverse as business management, law enforcement, and academic criminology. The mathematical genius of organized crime had created a legacy that would outlast any empire built on violence or corruption. Arthur Flegenheimer had died in a Newark hospital in 1935, but Dutch Schultz would live forever in the analytical framework he had created for understanding the mix of intelligence, ambition, and opportunity in American society. His story remained a testament to the dangerous possibilities of the American dream when pursued without moral limits, and a reminder that genius, like power, could be used for creation or destruction. The equation was complete, Dutch Schultz had balanced his life against the forces that shaped American organized crime, and his influence would continue to ripple through the criminal underworld long after his voice had been silenced forever. The arithmetic genius had solved his final problem: how to achieve immortality through the power of new ideas applied to the oldest and most dangerous profession in human history. The story of Dutch Schultz does not end neatly, nor does it close like the final chapter of a clean and proper book. It lingers like smoke, curling above a city street at midnight. The man himself is gone, long since lost to the past, yet his shadow stretches across history in strange ways. His name, his choices, his restless ambition, all have dissolved into the mist of memory, but they still whisper. Dutch Schultz was a man of contradictions, a son of immigrants who fought for a place in America's rising tide, a boy from the Bronx who carved out an empire with fists and fear, a gangster who dined in glittering restaurants but slept in a world of paranoia where allies could turn into enemies with a single glance. And yet, as we look back, his story softens. It becomes less about the violence and more about the strange fragility of human ambition. It becomes the tale of a man who thought himself untouchable, yet who fell as all men do when the weight of his choices pressed too hard. When you close your eyes tonight, imagine those dimly lit streets of New York in the 1920s and 30s. Hear the echo of footsteps on wet pavement. See the amber streetlight glow shining against the dark brim of a gangster's hat. The night is heavy, the city restless. And somewhere in that haze, Dutch Schultz walks on, not as a threat, not as a legend, but as a drifting figure of history. One more man swallowed by time. That is what this Sleepy Gangster Stories channel is here to do. Not to glorify, not to shock, but to soften these hard edges. To take the jagged lines of crime and history and turn them into shadows you can rest beside. Each story becomes less about the gunfire and more about the quiet streets afterward. Less about the names shouted in headlines and more about the silence that followed when the crowds went home. If you have stayed with me this far, then you have walked with Dutch Schultz through the last chapters of his life. You have felt the rise and the inevitable fall. And now, as the lights dim and the story draws to a close, you can let that tension slip away. The streets grow quiet. The rain settles. The city rests. And so can you. These stories, strange as they are, belong not only to history, but to the rhythm of the night. They are meant to carry you into rest, to remind you that even the most turbulent lives end in silence, that the past is never as loud as it once was. It is softened, muted like a gramophone's final crackle at the end of a song. If this story has kept you company tonight, then you might consider letting it lead you to the next. There are more gangsters whose names echo in history, men and women who walk their own crooked paths. Each has a story, each has a night to remember, and each will be told here in the same quiet rhythm, one after another. So if you would like to continue this journey through smoky jazz clubs, shadowed alleys, and the strange, restless dreams of America's underworld, stay with me. You can subscribe, not out of urgency, but as an invitation. Think of it as keeping the door unlocked to a quiet room where stories wait for you whenever you return. Here, the pace will always be slow. Here, the words will always be measured. Here, the legends of crime will be reshaped into something softer, something you can drift to sleep beside. Tonight, Dutch Schultz takes his bow. He disappears into the mist, leaving behind only a trace of smoke, a dim memory of ambition, and the faint sound of footsteps fading away. But tomorrow, another figure will come out of the shadows. Another shadow, another name, another voice from the past waiting to be retold. Until then, rest, close your eyes and let the city fade. The street lights dim, the footsteps stop, and the noise of the world grows still. History is long, but the night is patient, and as long as there are stories to tell, you will never drift alone. Thank you for spending this time with me, walking beside the restless figure of Dutch Schultz. If the story has soothed you, let it carry you gently toward rest, and when you wake, the next tale will be here, waiting, ready to guide you again through the calm shadows of the past. For now, good night.